What is going on, everybody? Welcome to Axioms on Trial. We are back with the original duo tonight. Cease doesn't have to fly solo, so
I'm glad you're back.
Yeah, we don't have to deal with that. In terms, hold on, let me back up. I said we don't have to deal with that. That made me feel like you were bad at it or something. So hold on, that's not a good thing.
I hate doing it by myself. No, I feel like I'm rambling.
So you know what I mean. So then you know what I mean when I say like. We have to deal with that. It's not an insult to you because that felt very.
Oh no! Even if it was, I would agree with you. I hate doing it by myself.
Sure,
I think I'm terrible.
Okay. Anyway, yeah. So I was like, I immediately said that. I was like, that sounded bad. It sounded horrible. No, you know what? It's not the real me. So I can excuse myself because it's a fake J Mike. What you're seeing on the screen, it's being impersonated by somebody.
Every time I'm doing it by myself, I literally sound like I'm just rambling like a lunatic. I'm so uncomfortable doing it on my own. I'm always glad that when you can be here.
You have to vamp a lot more.
Oh, it's horrible.
It's like if anyone does call-in shows and you're waiting on callers or anything like that, then and you gotta fill in that time, then you definitely feel that pressure, feel the heat a little more, but it makes you better. It makes you better at it. So
hopefully.
Before we get into it real quick, there's a lot of awesome people in the chat. I see shout out to Witters, of course, Spartan Theology, Katie, Courageous. I almost said cease to know, but you're right there. Just questions. Hopefully I say this. Ronan Torah. I hope I say that right. And Zach Rabones. Anyway, Cease, I'm going to pass it off.
And Genesis.
And Dragons. Oh, I just see. Yes, and longtime friend Dragons, of course. Cease, I'm going to kick it off to you. You kind of introduce the guest and tell everybody what's going on, and I'll get things in the background set up.
Cool. Yeah, so today I'm excited. We're having Captaindadpool on to talk about his deconversion, the way he understands interpreting the Bible, and different, I guess, comparing and contrasting different interpretations, and which kind of line of reasoning he thinks is more accurate or more accurate reading of the text. So I guess comparing more progressive views of Christianity versus more conservative ones, and just kind of learning a little bit more about him and his background and that sort of thing, and we'll see where the conversation goes to.
Let's go, guys.
Here we go.
Mr. Dad.
Thanks so much for coming.
My phone, whenever I was like saying stuff in live chats, it always puts Captaindadpool on there. So I'm always constantly putting Dadpool with the correction below it. So, but anyway, welcome in. I'll just like I fumble with introductions, I'll fumble with the spelling of Captaindadpool. But thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess let's start right from the beginning. Like, tell us a little bit about your background, your what is your degree in, and then what led you to kind of abandoning your faith and to where you are now.
Yes. So growing up, I had mild exposure to Christianity. I visited my grandma every other weekend, and then I'd go to church with her and my aunt and cousins. I saw the whole Heaven's Gates play, whatever that was called. Um, where they have different scenarios where they go to heaven or hell or whatever. And I kind of converted when I was little, but I didn't really know any better. And then, like, eventually I stopped going to that church or to church altogether for like several years. And I just never really thought about it. Um, and it was when I was in high school, I was invited to a youth group. I was 15. And I went, and it was very different from the previous church I went. Previous church was very boring, dry. And this one had like strobe lights and fog machines and a live band and a snack bar and crazy teenagers like myself running around who seemed very happy that I was there. Um, so I really enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun. And I kept going. I was hooked instantly. And I became kind of obsessed with the church life. I joined the drama team. I joined the worship band. Um, One second. Let me yell at my kids real quick.
So, Mike, you're also muted.
Yeah, when I worship band, I just wanted to do the hands up because every time I've been to a church.
So my experience has always been the opposite. I've always felt fairly uncomfortable in large groups, and I never really wanted to be in that kind of environment. I mean, I had my group of friends and everything, but the idea of going to like a large gathering like that would have been a nightmare for me growing up. Definitely not something that I would have enjoyed doing.
Okay, I think we're very good. It's about to be bedtime, so if there's any background noise, should end soon.
We're a family show. It's okay.
Okay, where was I? Yeah, so I really enjoyed it. Kept going. I joined the drama team, worship band. I went on evangelism trips and missionary trips and things like that over several years. I learned the Bible very, very well. Then eventually people started elders in the church would come up to me and tell me that God had placed a special call on my life for ministry because of how dedicated I was, how well I knew the Bible better than my peers. I'm not trying to brag; it's just the truth. And so I was like, oh well, that gave me like the recognition, and God is calling me. What an honor, So I went to Bible college. For 1 year, I couldn't finish. I couldn't keep going because of finances, so I attended a different one that was cheaper, and I couldn't finish that either. So I joined the military, as you do. I joined the Army as an infantryman. I deployed to Iraq in 2009. And when I got out, I had the GI Bill. And I was like, hey, let's finish my degree. So yeah, I went back to college. I pretty much had to start all over. Not many of my credits transferred. So a total of 6 years in Bible college, and finally graduated because I wanted to be a pastor. But my time in college, taught me a lot of things that I did not learn in church. And one of the things they tell you first, right out of the gate in Bible college, is forget everything you've ever learned about the Bible in church. It's probably not true. And that turned out to be the case. And my faith did not survive that, I guess you could say. I'd always, been told that the Gospels were reliable because they're written by 4 independent eyewitnesses that follow Jesus. And then I get to Bible college and learn from actual Bible scholars that no, that's definitely not the case. And so that kind of started like a domino effect. Started learning about what heaven and hell was in the Bible as opposed to what I was taught in church. And basically I graduated and I was still Christian, but I was deconstructing, and I didn't become like a full-fledged atheist until like 3 years after graduating. It's like 2 years ago, 2.5 years. So I'm a baby atheist.
Well, two quick questions. One, what do you think is the reason that there are these stark differences between what the church told you and what you learned in college? Like, why is it that where do you think that comes from?
It's a combination of a lot of different things. Most pastors don't know this stuff. You don't have to go to college to become a pastor. And you can go, and if you want to be a pastor, you can go to college to be a pastor. My major was biblical theology. My thinking was I wanted to understand the Bible because I was like, if I want to be a pastor, I can learn how to pastor a church on the job. I'm not worried about that. I was worried about being able to preach from the Bible and preach accurately. So I didn't. There's biblical ministry, youth ministry, children's ministry, those types of majors. But I went for theology because I wanted to understand the Bible. So most pastors don't have this kind of education, and even if they do, they'll either ignore it, just not think about it, or can somehow reconcile their faith with that. There's a lot of Christians that are doing that, which I was able to do, obviously. But yeah, I'd say that probably the largest case is pastors just don't get that kind of education about the Bible that they're preaching from.
Right. So I guess maybe one good places to go is maybe you can dispel some of these myths about the Bible. Like you mentioned how the church teaches that there were 4 reliable eyewitnesses, this idea of heaven and hell. You can go into why those things are actually not accurate to the actual writings.
Yeah, so that Jesus' disciples, one, that the Gospels are written anonymously. The authors were ascribed to them about 250 years ago by Tertullian.
Wait, hold on. Mark didn't write Mark?
I know.
Hold on, breaking news, everybody.
What? Yeah.
Breaking news.
Right? Yeah. No, totes cereal right now. Yeah, if you read the Gospels, they don't claim authorship. Even Luke says he got his information from various sources. They don't mention themselves. They didn't say, then Jesus picked me as the disciple. The names in big letters on top were added about 250 years later. Aside from that, the Gospels were written 30, 40, 50 years after Jesus' death. The literacy rate in ancient Palestine at the time was somewhere between 3 and 6%. They most certainly would not have been literate. Jesus probably was not literate himself, coming from Nazareth, a very small, rinky-dink, unknown town. He most likely couldn't read or write either. And then, of course, the Gospels were originally written in Koine and Greek. There is no way that they would have. They spoke Aramaic. That was
I was gonna say they spoke Aramaic. Yeah.
Yeah. There was no way that they would have been able to learn a second language. First, they would have had to learn their own language and learn how to read and write in their own language, and then learn another language and learn how to read and write in it.
Sure.
There were no schools where you could do that as an adult. If you wanted to do that, you had to hire somebody to privately come and tutor you, and that was very expensive. So the chance of that happening, the story circulated and spread until they got to somebody who could write them down, which is why it took so long. No idea who wrote the Gospels. Heaven and hell. The Bible consistently teaches about Sheol, which is a place where your body goes and just is there until the day of judgment. And on the day of judgment, you either make it into paradise or you are annihilated. You're not sent to hell to burn for eternity. That idea came from the Apocalypse of Peter, more or less, written in the 2nd century. It even mentions the same Apocalypse of Peter mentions the angels as having milky white skin and golden curly hair, and they're bright as the sun, and they sing in choruses, like that stereotypical idea of angels. That's where that comes from, the Apocalypse of Peter.
Yeah.
So all these ideas about burning for eternity in hell is not biblical at all. Jesus didn't teach that. Paul didn't teach that, and even Revelation doesn't teach that if you understand it.
So why do you think that Peter added something like that? Like, where does that? What was the purpose of?
It's just the way that literature evolved. So they would take like a chunk, or even just one scripture out of like a gospel, and then they'll make an entire gospel out of it. Like the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is taken from one little passage about an interaction between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. So they took that and they made an entire story out of it. Same thing, Apocalypse of Peter probably had Influences from Enoch as well, because in Enoch, Raphael, the archangel Raphael takes Enoch on a tour of heaven and hell, and then in the Apocalypse of Peter, same thing happens, but now it's much more graphically detailed. Like those who are in hell. If you are a woman who is obsessed with her beauty, you're hung over a flame by your hair. If you're a man who commits adultery, you are hung over flames by another part of your body. You can probably imagine. So yeah, the Apocalypse of Peter goes into much more detail about this idea, because that's just the nature of how it evolves. And then you get later into Paradise Lost and the Inferno by Dante Alighieri, and you see how they continue to evolve.
Want to give a real fast. So let me cut you guys off just real fast. Witter gave a donation $9.99. We really appreciate that, and he asked. They asked a question. I'm actually I'm not really sure. I want to misgender them. How did the idea that the Gospels are inerrant come about, considering the contradictions?
That more or less came from the Enlightenment period. The doctrine of inerrancy was not really a thing for a very, very long time. The early church believed that the Gospels were inspired by God, but not inerrant. Early church fathers, Justin Martyr, for example, described the Gospels and other books as what was safe to be read in the church. He didn't call them Gospels. He didn't call them God's Word. He didn't call them inspired. He said they were what was safe to be read in church. That's it.
Yeah.
So the idea of inerrancy came much, much later. And that's kind of what led to the NIV translation, actually. The team of scholars responsible for translating the NIV, they subscribed to a version of the Doctrine of Inerrancy. So they edited little things to make the text seem more uniform. So yeah, it was an idea that came much later, and there are a lot of Christians that are starting to realize that and are starting to move back towards that original idea. But
what do you think about? Are you familiar with I think we talked about it a couple times. I'm extremely rusty on it in terms of biblical scripture, but what do you think about what Dr. Mark Goodacre, if you're familiar with his work, has done with editorial fatigue and
editorial fatigue? Yeah,
docile reproduction, I think, was the original term, and then it's also just known as editorial fatigue. For those that don't know, you can do a quick Google search. It's a really cool document. I think it's probably the first thing you'll find if you type in docile reproduction or editorial fatigue. And it goes through some examples, but one of the ones I've given on the show a few times is Herod Antipas being referred to as a king in Mark, but also referred to as a tetrarch, which would be historically accurate in Matthew. And what do you think about those types of editorial contradictions and things like that?
You can see that really well in the Gospel of John, actually. The Synoptic Gospels actually get a lot of details wrong about geography and ancient Jewish law and practices. And John, the latest Gospel, written 60-ish years after Jesus' death, comes along and corrects, though, especially with the account of Joseph of Arimathea. If you read the 4 different accounts in John's, it's much more detailed, because the author of John understood that, hey, these guys aren't right about this. So yeah, it's definitely a thing. And Mark Goodacre is a opponent of the Q source document.
Yes.
Which I'm still working on how I feel about that at the moment. I think I believe, or I'm more or less subscribing to the Q source document, but I'm open to being changed on that. I haven't read Mark Goodacre's book yet.
But I'm very rusty on it myself. So I got to go back, because I think there's a lot of things that going into it,
what I do remember, though, is
got confused on, but I would be in line to agree with what I remembered from it. I think the idea was a lot of the source coming from Luke, just having in order to basically fill in the double tradition, just had sources from Matthew, right? Was what he had.
Yeah, Luke copied Matthew. And then Matthew copied Mark, and Luke copied Mark and Matthew anyway. Yeah, I've read Bart Ehrman's critique on Mark Whitaker's book.
Oh,
And,
I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, he said actually he makes really good arguments, which is high praise from Bart Ehrman. Like if Bart Ehrman disagrees, he'll straight up say like, no, you're wrong. This is very, but he says like, I'm not convinced, but these are really good arguments that Mark Whitaker is presenting here. So
Sure.
Still working on my thoughts on that.
One question I had was about kind of the conflict between more conservative Christians and progressive ones on the issue of homosexuality. Like I've heard it said that, the passages or the verses in Leviticus and elsewhere have been used against gay people. It was actually a mistranslation. What do you think about that assertion? Because
it's not a mistranslation. I mean, it is and it isn't. It's true that it's the term homosexual wasn't introduced until 1946. But that's just the word that we use in our language that differs from the words that they use in their language. The text does speak about same-sex relations. So
it doesn't speak about pedophilia specifically, about same-sex relations.
Okay, so in Leviticus 18, chapter 18 and chapter 20, it uses two different words for man. One is Aish. Aish means man, like adult man, and then Zahar. Zahar just means male. It's different. Doesn't mean it has no connotation of age or even species. The same word is used referring to animals. So the strictest interpretation or the strictest reading of the text would be adult men shall not lay with males of every kind. That would include pedophilia. That would include sex slaves. That would include bestiality, but it seems to imply it also includes same-sex relations, consensual or otherwise.
Gotcha.
And it does say that in chapter 20 that both shall be put to death.
So you're saying it's in reference to the whole, not the parts that people kind of want to pick out.
It's
as the
Like
it's the whole domain, not whatever individual part people are trying to attribute it to. Because that's what it seems to be the argument that I get from the other side is, well, no, it's reference to this part of it, not this whole domain. And it's like when you press them, I'm sorry, you're just going to say the whole umbrella of homosexuality is wrong once I really press you anyway. So I don't know why you play this game whenever you're just going to concede that anyway.
Zahar is a very, very broad term. The argument is if it was referring to consensual same-sex relations, it would say that Aish shall not lay with Aish instead of Aish shall not lay with Zahar. So that's the argument, that if it was specifically condemning consensual same-sex relations, it would say that. That's a difficult conclusion for me to come to, especially since, again, in 20, they're both put to death, both of them. Now, my sort of like olive branch to the other side is it never condemns it as sin, and never condemns them as going to hell or having their book erased or their name erased from the book of judgment. It says they should be put to death, and Paul says the same thing in Romans 20 or in Romans 5 or whatever it was. They deserve death. Doesn't say they're going to hell. Jesus never references it. So that's maybe the best olive branch I can give. And then in Revelation 29:11, it never references sexual sin at all. It gives a list of all the people that will have their part in the lake of fire. But it never mentions sexual sin at all. It means like liars, thieves, adulterers, or not adulterers, liars, thieves, blasphemers, things like that. So an argument can be made that if the Bible wanted to condemn it harder, it could have.
Right.
But if it wanted to be more specific about condemning pedophilia,
It also,
it could have done that too. There's a separate word for boy that the text doesn't use.
Right.
So it does go back to that. What was the author's intent when they wrote this? And that's, of course, incredibly difficult to conclude.
Right.
Sure.
Mike, did you have anything you want to ask? Because
Well, yeah. So I'm wondering in where to fit in the interpretation type of thing, but I guess we could move to that now if you'd want.
Sure.
Yeah. So from my standpoint, like as a non-believer, and we've kind of talked about this before the show. I have like this issue with any text. Like, so we just had that example right there where there's some interpretation or some language issue. Once you get to English and it's specific and someone says, okay, someone should not lay with another man or whatever, right? That's kind of the information that's fed to you. And then you have to use some interpretation of that. And most people are going to use some like literal interpretation of, yeah, you should not do that. Setting aside that there's like already some issue from translation, even if we had like the proper translation, even if I threw that away, I'm wondering how you would feel about how somebody would know, like even yourself, like even if you analyze the text and you go, I think it says this, or some Christian goes, I think it says Y, you're saying it says X. My biggest thing is that I don't know that any person can have some justificatory basis on which one is right? Because it seems like what you're doing is interpreting what God means. And if we just assume God exists for the sake of the argument, or just as kind of a fictionalist approach, just to like as if we're talking about Lord of the Rings and we're just going to assume the characters exist type of a
just to
scenario,
move forward
right?
with
Yeah. Or we can even grant that they exist if we want. But I'm wondering, without having access to the speaker, how you know that's what the speaker meant. For me, that's a roadblock for any type of analysis that New Testament scholars or people like that can do. To me, from my perspective, it seems all to be moot because there's no access to the speaker, right? It seems that everyone's just going to beg the question on what they think the text means based on whatever interpretive principle they use, but nobody's ever going to be able to justify what interpretive principle, whether it's Bart Ehrman, whether it's some Christian, whoever.
Yeah.
What they say this means the text. I don't know that that's even possible to do. So I don't know what you think about that argument. It's more of like a philosophical argument. It's not a very out there one. It's just without having access to God, how do you know that's what that verse means? You never can actually know, right?
Yeah, true. And just like philosophy, you can never really know anything, can you?
Sure.
The idea is to get as close as you possibly can. How dedicated are you to finding the answer is the question. So like if you're reading a text and you really want to get into it, you have to understand the cultural context. You got to understand the original language. For example, in Greek, there's 3 words for love. There's agape, phileo, and eros. Agape, you may have heard, is the unconditional love that God has for us. Phileo is a brotherly love, and eros, of course, where we get the word erotic, is a sexual love. So there's that dialogue between Peter and Jesus where he says, Peter, do you love me? And he says, yeah, you know I love you. Well, then feed my sheep. And he asks the same question again. And he asks the third question, you love me? Yeah, then go feed my sheep. So it's using the different words for love there. It's saying like, Peter, do you phileo me? Or do you agape me? And Peter's like, I phileo you. And Jesus like, so you phileo me? He's like, yeah, I phileo you. Like, but I'd like you to agape me. It's that kind of idea. It's like, how much do you love me? I love you this much. That's something that we don't get because it's just love, the same word, used the same time in each verse.
Sure.
So there's definitely a lot that gets lost in translation, and then like I'm trying to think of an example of like a good cultural context.
Well, so I guess my argument goes towards like even if we just assume we had the right language, that it was, right, we understood the correct preservation, I guess, of the text, right?
Yeah.
My thing is there's still like an additional problem of
How
literal
interprets
literal or metaphorical interpretations, or right. It seems to me that like anybody can do what they want with it because of the fact that there's nothing independent that's going to justify what interpretation you use. So it seems like to me, like, I don't know on the basis of what, anybody from any side could say, well, right. So like Bart uses an example. I think Bart takes the idea that like there's no real hell, right? I believe that's it's really just it's not really like an literal hell, and he's saying that's not what was being proclaimed there. But for me, I'm like, I don't know what stops the Christian from saying that there was. There's nothing that's going to be independent that's going to justify Bart or the Christian that disagrees. Or the person that takes annihilation versus the person that says no, there's a literal hell that you'll go to. That seems to be this weird roadblock for me. I don't know. That's just an idea that I'm kind of presenting to you to see what you think about it. Because to me, it seems to be for any religious text that says it's in Scripture without having direct access to the thing, you can manipulate it for any use you want. It just kind of comes baked in there for free. It seems to be to me.
Yeah, and the Bible kind of lends itself to that. It lends itself to very loose interpretations. And another big problem is with churches, is when they read the Bible and they interpret it through a lens that they were given by their church.
Exactly.
I've said this. What I like to say is, nobody reads the Bible and studies it and then goes to church to learn what it says. Everybody goes to church first and then learns what the Bible says, and then maybe decides to read it on their own. And even if they do decide to read it on their own, they're always going to read it through that lens that was given to them by the church. I
kind of like whenever you believe in some God, and then later you're like, I'm going to present philosophical arguments on why I believe in the God, even though that's not what convinced me why it was true.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's very similar.
I mean, just kind of based on reacting to what's being said here, like, I mean, I do agree, obviously, that when it comes to literature, we have no methodology to actually point to one interpretation and say, like, that's the true interpretation. But I do think that when we do have the preserved language and some context clues, there is some way to narrow down at least the validity of some interpretations in relationship to others.
Yeah, you can get very close if you do your homework.
So, like, I don't think it's all relative to where, like, there's no moving forward. Like, I mean, and I think it's the same thing with any kind of writing. Like,
well, I mean,
yes.
I do if you think it's going to be like, if the claim is it's inerrant, or like the claim is that you should be able to understand what God means here. Because,
of course.
Because I don't know, we don't have any text that does that. We don't even have a book that does that. We have people that look at philosophy. We have people that argue what Quine meant here, or right. So, and without this direct access to the speaker, it doesn't seem that they can. I mean, you still have this. To me, you have a problem. It's kind of Wittgenstein's kind of thing, right? This privatization of language. Like, even if we were like, hey, who was it that presented objectivism? Ayn Rand. Like, if we were like, Anne, like, defend yourself on objectivism, and we want to give you another chance on why it's, why isn't it crazy of a theory? And then she comes and explains it, and it seems satisfactory to some people. Like, there's still that level of like, well, was there like language just kind of used to persuade you from like a rhetoric type of standpoint? And for my issue is like, I don't know that any analysis of text without the speaker, even with the speaker, is going to be helpful. But even if I just grant that having the speaker would be beneficial, like, we don't have God to have access to it. To me, I guess it's a long-winded point just to say I don't know what good analysis of the text does without the deity that's supposed to have handed it down, right?
Well,
It seems to be seems to just be I have a phenomenological state that thinks X about this, and I have a phenomenological state or mental state that thinks X about this text, and then you have nothing to actually go, okay, it actually aligns with what it meant because we don't have that thing, right? To me, that
so
seems a
two quick things, because I agree with you, especially if the notion is that it's an errand, then yeah, you're going to run into some real problems there. I agree with that, but even when you mentioned philosophy, yes, of course, even with philosophy, people can have different interpretations of what's being said, and you see that everywhere. But there are also interpretations that are clearly inaccurate. For example, the fact that the Nazis tried to use Nietzsche's writings to support their nationalism and ideology, when Nietzsche is very clearly, I mean, if there's one thing that he hates is German nationalism. There is there's a space to where you end up with
yeah.
with a
I'll grant,
vast
sure, yeah,
number of interpretations,
yeah.
where it's like we don't have anywhere to move forward. But then there are some that are like, yeah, this is clearly a misrepresentation of what's being said. And real quick before we move forward, because in the comment section they're having the conversation about homosexuality, and it was brought up that it's the atheists that seem to be cherry picking. It's almost like a talking point that religion is against gays when in reality it isn't. But I want to post this comment that I think is a good one. It's literally within the law code pointing that out. Is not cherry picking, ignoring it. It is. So, I mean, I do think that you find verses in the Bible that are inclusive. No one's denying this. But you also find ones that clearly are not inclusive and are hateful and divisive. And we kind of have to observe the totality of what the books are saying, and not ignore what's taking place.
Yeah,
I would love to
go
say
ahead.
that the Bible is not anti same-sex relations. I would love to say that, but the reality is I just don't see it. It clearly does not have a very favorable view. Like I have no problem saying that Paul was a bit of a feminist by his by his standards at the time. Like Paul was preaching some different shit that nobody else was saying. He was putting women in charge. So Paul, like I can call Paul progressive and see that in the text. I got no problem with that.
And real quick, something like this: the purpose of practicing lectio divina, which is contemplation of Scripture, is to discern the true spiritual knowledge from false within Scripture. What methodology you apply to actually do this and know you were right seems to miss the point.
Well, that something like that would lend itself to cherry picking, to pick and choose which verses are actually spiritual or some sort of test, or this verse is actually mistranslated. It's like that's cherry picking. If you ask me, does the Bible condemn same-sex relations? I'm going to say yes. If you want to ask me, is it was that a later manipulation of the text, or is that a misunderstanding of the text? That's kind of a separate conversation. But yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. What was? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh no, you're fine. There's two things I wanted to address real quick. One is a good question. The first thing, when I hear things like when you talk about agape and cafe is saying agape is theological teaching.
Yeah.
I don't. To me, like that's normative, like right to say like that's love or something. What I mean is like that attributes to, like, in order for you to achieve what you would call agape, right? You would have to be in accord with some standard or some goal, right, to achieve that. So it's normative. Yeah. But the problem is that just because you bake in love or something there doesn't mean that you couldn't bake in like anti-gay, code or things in there, right? Like, or whatever the code is described in there could just be said that this is God's love, even though to some person, because that's not love. That's like, right, like drowning the world or something. And being, well, that was agape. It was God's like love for the world, right, or something, right? It's like, well, yeah, that normative assessment's not what I attribute to love, right? It's some other normative standard. So I just wanted to point out that
it's not necessarily theological in the sense that it's unique to God. It just means agape just means unconditional love.
Yes, but the love part is the problem I have, because it's normative. It's just like whatever love is going to be relative from my perspective on what they mean, right? Even Cease, who's a moral realist, he's going to disagree. He's going to go, that's not what like the good is, right? He's going to go, that's different than what I think the good is. So to just say it's unconditional love and use that from a philosophical standpoint just always begs the question. I raise this because I hear Christians bring that up, and it bothers me. They'll be like, well, agape, is like unconditional love. And I'm sitting there going, well, that reifies nothing for me. All it reifies is that you attribute some label to something that I think is actually evil. It doesn't matter that you decide to call it agape and call it unconditional love. To me, that's reifies nothing to me. But I just wanted to point that out because I've heard Cafe use that agape thing plenty of times. And so if he can show me why that normative assessment's the right normative assessment, then that'd be great. But that's a whole other philosophical thing to go down. Second thing is this, I guess this is for you, Captaindadpool. How do you determine what is divinely inspired? I guess for anybody. How do you determine what is divinely inspired versus what is not? Or rather, what parts of the Bible should we ignore and what not? Like, or I guess what would be your opinion on how people handle those things and how people kind of cherry pick, since we're on that topic?
I mean, it's a tough one because obviously I don't think any of it was divinely inspired. And even the early church fathers wouldn't have said that they were divinely inspired. They would just say that they were theologically accurate or attributed to the accurate author or whatever. So divine inspiration is, it was not the original understanding of the scripture. Now, if you want to ask what was originally there, what is the truest form of the text? Well, that's where textual criticism comes in. That's where you take our oldest manuscripts, see what they say, and even though our oldest manuscripts are 200-300 years after the fact, that doesn't necessarily mean that it originally said that, because we don't have anything prior to that. So then you have to try and figure out what changed prior to us discovering that, or prior to that text being written. And to do that, you got to go say, would this person have said this given that culture at that time? And it's what textual criticism is. It's a whole thing. Yeah, not sure where I was going with that.
Yeah, no, and Cease, we cut you off, so hopefully you remember what you were saying.
Yeah, I guess.
Or I cut you off. Better yet.
What was the experience of your deconstruction and eventual conversion like? What was that like for you?
It was really difficult. Because you're faced with a lot of different things. You go through a full-blown existential crisis, identity crisis. You put your entire sense of self into this thing for so long, for 15 years, for me, 6 years in college. And then you realize it's all bullshit. I have a degree in mythology. Mythology that I believed wholeheartedly at one time. So then you start really thinking, who am I even? I've been this pretend person that the church wants me to be, because they told me that how God wants me to be. So I was like, am I even who I'm actually supposed to be right now? So who am I really? So you go through this process of like rediscovering yourself, which can be kind of fun. You start listening to music that you didn't think you were allowed to listen to before. You start watching movies you didn't think you were allowed to watch before, and you start exploring other hobbies that you didn't have the time for before because you were always involved in church. So it's this big self-discovery process. But at the same time, it does get very lonely because all this time you believe that there was God who was there watching you correcting your mistakes, guiding you to success, blessing you, answering your prayers, all these things. And then you realize, no, he was never there in the first place. So what do I do with that information? And then you kind of realize, oh shit, it was me this whole time. Like, there was never a God helping me through all of the things that I went through. It was all me.
You mentioned having an existential crisis. What brought you to sort of retaining a sense of meaning in your life and yourself through that?
Let's go in. I'd say I just kind of learned to live in the moment. I stopped worrying about the past. I stopped worrying about the future. And just kind of learned to live in the moment. Like the moment I became an atheist is that I was literally crying tears out of my eyes to God in my car, driving to help somebody move a dresser. I remember it very, very vividly. And I was like, God, I need you in some way to show me that you're here for me. Like, I'm not asking for proof or a sign because that's not how you work, but you know what I need. So help me believe that you are still here for me. And then as soon as
you're like, I really don't want to move this dresser. Just help me, just get it out of here for you.
Strength of Samson right now. So as soon as I asked that question, there's just this, and I'd never heard this story before until I started telling it. I had so many people tell me, oh my God, they did the exact same thing. There's just this overwhelming sense of peace that I'd never felt before in my life. And then like at that moment, I'd like stop crying and I was like, all of a sudden, I'm fine. I'm all good over here. Like, I'm not worried about anything anymore. So I just went about my day like normal. And then, just started to, live in the moment, I guess, and rediscover myself.
Sure. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Cease.
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I kind of use this example. It's coined by Oz from the Tang Gang, but he puts it away where it's like either you are a microwave atheist where it just kind of you pop in, you pop out, and you're kind of ready to go. You're like Uncle Ben's rice, or you're like a crock pot atheist and you kind of sit there for a minute. So you which one would you?
I was definitely a crock pot. I fought it for years.
Sure. Yeah.
Like I deconstructed is the word being used. It's the new sexy word.
Mm-hmm.
But I deconstructed different things over time. Like, okay, the Gospels were in anonymously, going to work on that. The Bible actually teaches annihilationism, not hell. I'm actually okay with that. That's not a problem. Then start thinking about, issues of evil and, theodicy and all this other stuff. And so it was very, very progressive. Like, one belief kind of fell after the other until there was like nothing left of Christianity. Like, I believed in nothing Christianity anymore. But I was like, okay, what about God? Is there still a God? And then I was like, no, I don't think there is. I'm pretty sure there's not, actually.
Sure.
Here's a couple other questions that are often talking points I hear from Christians who want to bring credence to the idea of the resurrection. They'll say things like, well, if Jesus didn't resurrect, how do you explain the fact that Christianity continued to spread?
How
do you explain the fact that people died for those beliefs, especially when they had expected him to be dead? Why would they come back and suddenly believe this?
Yeah. Are you asking me to respond to those?
To respond to that kind of thing.
All while realizing that no religion ever has spread ever. That's not a thing. We have to remember that before you talk, that no religion has ever spread successfully. So we just have to remember that. So it makes it such a great thing.
Yeah. Well, the thing about the spread of Christianity is it's the result of a massive smear campaign, like quite literally. After Jesus died, there was a bunch of other Christian groups that popped up, and they had all kinds of different beliefs and ideas about who Jesus was. And one group decided that they were right and everybody else was wrong. So they started a smear campaign against all those other Christian groups. They had heresy hunters, the proto-Orthodox Christians they were called. They had heresy hunters that would go out and debate them. They would spread rumors. Like we have that these are written about by the early heresy hunters like Tertullian and etc. They would say like this group of Christians over here, they perform child sacrifices. You don't want to be associated with them, do you?
Yeah.
This group of Gnostics over here, they have very graphically described orgies. You don't want to be have anything to do with that, do you? So they were not just better at proselytizing, they were better at demonizing the other ones. And that's ultimately the brand of Christianity that Constantine subscribed to when he became the Emperor of Rome. And then he heavily incentivized converting to that brand of Christianity. He gave you a tax break, all kinds of shit. He built churches. He had pagan temples be condemned. His son especially did this even more. There were certain sanctions put up against the Jews in Rome. So he heavily favored this brand of Christianity, and he paid to have 50 Bibles put together and spread throughout the empire. Prior to that, our manuscripts were pretty scarce. There's not a lot of them. Then he comes out and he actually hires like professional scribes to write the Bible that they had at the time and then spread it out. And that's kind of where it went from there. You were not allowed to have another religion. Right.
Well, I guess one question is like,
yeah,
why would Christians remain Christians after they saw that Jesus didn't resurrect?
Oh, yeah. Here's the thing about the resurrection. Paul did not believe in a bodily resurrection. He believed in a spiritual one. He says this over and over again in Romans, 1 Corinthians 15. We are sown a physical body and raised a spiritual body. Now it's not spiritual like he's a specter, right? Like their idea of a resurrection is you would come from the old body, but when you came out of the new body, you got a new body, or when you came out of the old body, you got a new body, and you could kind of walk around in the flesh. That was the idea about resurrection at the time. That didn't depend on an empty tomb. That didn't depend on, Joseph of Arimathea. That didn't depend on, that didn't depend on the discovery of an empty tomb. They believed that Jesus resurrected because they believed he resurrected in spiritual form. It was only later. Good.
Sorry, I was going to say, is this new body, does it look the same as the old body, or can it look like a new?
He also says that we're sown in corruption and raised in glory, or something like that. And when Jesus resurrected, Mary, who was caring for the tomb, mistook him for the gardener. She didn't recognize him.
Well, isn't that convenient?
Yeah, right. That's because he got his new earthly body. You know, he was wearing his new drip. That's what kids would say.
Right.
So that was the idea about the resurrection. So like when I hear Christians try to argue for the burial, the empty tomb, and the bodily resurrection of Jesus, I like to say that was not the earliest form of the resurrection. The earliest form of the resurrection was spiritual. It became more and more physical to combat the docetic groups that started rising up, who believed that Jesus was spiritual throughout his entire life, not just after his resurrection. These are the ones that Paul references when he talks about those of us who were never truly of us, so they left, and they subscribed to myths of Jesus. That's who he's talking about, the docetic groups.
Yeah.
So the scriptures and the Gospels evolved, especially Luke and John, go out of their way to emphasize a physical, fleshly resurrection, and a physical, fleshly Jesus. Like this is a later textual addition by a scribe, but the verse about Jesus sweating blood and crying so hard, this was written to overly emphasize how physical and how human he was.
Right. Well, I want to add on top of that. That even the term "seen" is mostly a metaphorical one, as far as I understand it. Because seen could also have meant seen in relation to the so-called witnesses of that he resurrected and having seen Jesus back on earth, right?
Yeah.
Seen also meant felt, also meant envisioned, also meant dreamed, right?
Yeah.
So it's been a constructed narrative that took place way after the fact that they saw Jesus in the flesh as he had been previously. It's not even a biblical notion. It's just a reconstruction I think, to gain power over people.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I'm excited to kind of use some of your knowledge next time I have a debate in the resurrection. I'll definitely be taking some of what you've been saying here.
Yeah, definitely.
I appreciate.
Need help with that? Hit me up. Actually, just
for sure I will.
I'm to the point where I can just grant a resurrection that doesn't get you to Yahweh. Honestly, I want to give you every toy you have, and a resurrection, in my opinion, does not grant that Yahweh exists. It just grants a couple things. Grants Yahweh could exist. It grants that there are beings that are capable of deceiving us.
Right.
And anyone that says like that's absurd, well, I think they're equally absurd propositions, but
And it doesn't also mean prove divinity, because apparently there are a bunch of people who resurrect in the Bible who weren't said to be of a divine nature of any kind, right? If I'm not mistaken.
It was resurrections in other.
I think it was.
Yeah, resurrections in other types of religion. So for all you know, it could just be attributed to that worldview. Yeah. But so I never understand why we just assume the worldview to be true, but off that basis. But
how do you respond to talks about prophecy, which I hear both Christians and Muslims constantly spew? It's how can this not be true when you have X, Y, and Z prophecy that came true?
Yeah. So the problem with biblical prophecy is, one, if you want to talk about messianic prophecies, Jesus never fulfilled any of the messianic prophecies. The Messiah was supposed to be a ruler, a literal king of Israel who's supposed to unite the nations and end the wars. That's who the Messiah was supposed to be. Jesus didn't fulfill any of that. That's why his disciples were mourning so heavily after he was executed, because they thought he was the Messiah. How could this happen? So the verses that Christians use to justify Jesus being the Messiah are horribly taken out of context. They're not prophetic. They're talking about another individual entirely. A great example is Isaiah 7, is where the prophecy of the virgin birth is. Well, one, the Septuagint mistranslates the word, and it's not originally virgin, it just means young woman. And hey, that child is born in the next chapter. If you just read a little bit further, that child is Isaiah's son. So it's things like that that are ripped horribly out of context. And then there's other prophecies like Daniel. Daniel's a great one too. Daniel seems to predict a prophecy, but in reality, Daniel is there's like 2 or 3 different parts of Daniel put together, and the last like several chapters are actually written in the 2nd century. So they're not predicting something that is going to happen. They're recording something that already did happen, all while claiming to predict.
Isn't Daniel mainly a forgery as well, from my understanding, or am I thinking of something else?
Well, it's not a forgery in the sense of it. I mean, it probably wasn't written by Daniel. We don't know who wrote it. But it's like 2 or 3 texts that are put together.
Okay.
It's apocalyptic literature. I don't know if I'd call it a forgery.
Sure. Okay.
Other than the fact that it claims to be predicting things that had already happened.
So is that? So what is the purpose of that? Like, why do they do that? Pretend to predict things that already happened? Is it just, again, a tool for control, social control?
In Daniel's case specifically, I don't know. That's a hard one to answer, honestly. I can't really get in the mind of Daniel or whoever wrote those few chapters. It's possible. it's also possible that he's trying to make sense of what was happening around him. Maybe he was having genuine visions, and they were actually dreams that related to events that he had witnessed. You know, we have dreams like that all the time. So maybe he was writing that down. I had a dream like this. So yeah.
I would also add that all of these prophecies in both Islam and Christianity are either so general,
it's
and so vague that you can kind of fit anything by playing around with the words.
Fallacy after ambiguity fallacy after ambiguity fallacy. Yeah.
I mean, the fact that, I think at this point I probably argue more with Muslims than I do Christians, and the fact that they think that this prophecy that in the desert one day tall buildings will exist, the fact that they find that to be impressive as a prophecy, it's just so strange to me that something like that would somehow be evidence of God, when something like the Simpsons makes more accurate, ridiculous predictions than anything you'll ever find in any of the holy books.
Yeah, Islam is another animal.
Yeah.
Sure. Like they wrote about things that they knew at the time. They just claimed that they didn't know at the time.
Right.
You know, all while ripping from like other authors. Like a great example is the Quran's teachings about embryology.
Yeah, I was just about to.
Straight rip from Galen, written 700 years prior. Like Galen wrote the exact same shit, almost word for word, and he learned that by operating on monkeys or chimpanzees, I think it was.
They weren't even right.
Yeah, it wasn't even right. And then you have like the whole it talks about I fucking love all the different responses between about semen coming from between the backbone and the rib.
Yeah,
they come up with the most creative shit to explain that. Like I heard one is like if you would X-ray a male like vertically and then you like look up like between their legs, it looks like the genitals are between the backbone and the rib, and that's what that means. Like another interpretation is it's actually talking about the female egg somehow. Like how the fuck is it talking about that? It doesn't mention the female egg. They didn't know about the egg at the time.
They said that the babies were produced from like blood clots, right?
Yeah, they're clinging clots of blood. And at no point are we a clinging clot of blood.
Yeah, which is weird because it's like they say like the bone is produced first and then muscles are subsequently wrapped around it.
Yeah,
which is like not
both, even. They both develop at the exact same time.
Yeah.
I did a review. I did an episode a couple of episodes ago where they talk about how the poetry of the Quran and the fact that it was never what was the thing? Reproduced by some other author is itself a miracle. Like, how could something like that have come out if not from a god? And I'm like, what you think about poetry is entirely your subjective opinion. Like you're describing it, like it's just such a ridiculous. Go ahead.
It's nuts because I've read the Quran in its entirety. It's not I would never categorize it as being poetic or unique and special.
Believer.
It's not an easy book to read. It's not a fun book to read. I don't get it. Like, are you serious?
Oh, I got super bored. Like, I got so bored reading "Oh Believer" about the 700th time. I was about over it.
Yeah. Like and that's that's a level of delusion and brainwashing that these people go through. It's like they've just decided that this document is like the most incredible thing to ever grace Earth, and it's baseless. It's just what they want to be true.
What's ironic about Islam and the Quran is I've seen a lot of Muslims use the whole the New Testament was voted in the Council of Nicaea, which of course isn't true, but they don't know any better. They use that, and the reality is the Quran was compiled in such a way, and all of the original sources were destroyed. like the Quran is perfectly preserved. One, the perfect preservation of a text is not evidence of divine origin.
Well,
We have lots
yeah,
of
preservation doesn't entail that
yeah,
at
it's
all.
nothing. For some reason, they lean on
This
that
video
so hard.
will be this video. I always use this video will be perfectly preserved in the future. Doesn't mean that things I said were true.
Yeah, like we have the Mesha stele, which outlines Second Kings. I forget the chapter and verse, but it tells the story of how the pagan god Chemosh defeated Yahweh because his servant sacrificed his only son to him during a siege. And I'm like, it was inscribed in stone. That is perfectly preserved. No one has ever come around and altered that. And it is like 1,500 or like 1,500 years older than the Quran. So is that perfectly preserved? So anyway, but like they like to insist that no, it's perfectly preserved. So I'm like, okay, let's examine that. Caliph Uthman, the third caliph, ordered all of the Qurans to come to him. There were multiple Qurans. One was owned by Muhammad's wife. It's called Codex Hafsa. And she said no at first because he knew of her plan. She knew of his plans to destroy them afterwards. And she eventually said, yeah, I'll give it to you, but you have to give it back to me when you're done with it. And he said, okay, he agreed. And he took it, he used it to make the Quran along with everything else, and destroyed everything else, but gave her hers back. That is until she died. Then he went to her house, found it, and destroyed it. So I'm like, how do you know the Quran is perfectly preserved when all of the evidence was fucking destroyed on purpose? In the real world, we don't call that evidence. We call that the destruction of evidence. Yeah. So
I always, whenever I get into that conversation with Muslims, it always breaks down to me going, okay, is there a logical contradiction for a message that is wrong to be preserved, perfectly preserved? And if they bite the bullet, they go, no, if it's perfectly preserved, it can't be wrong. If you want to bite that bullet, like, then I'm even happier, because now you just look really dumb. Like that you were really going to fall on the hill of, any perfectly preserved message entails the truth of the proposition. It's like, what? And so that's why I never understand, because once they say yes, a proposition or some message can be perfectly preserved and still be wrong, then my thing is, okay, well, we can't use that. You can't use that as a leg up, because you've just admitted that the perfectly preserved message could be wrong, right? Unless you're just going to invoke special pleading and say, well, this is different. And if you say, well, this is different, I need to know in virtue of what. And usually it's in virtue of, because this is the thing I believe in, so.
Yeah, like Mein Kampf is perfectly preserved. Word for word, nothing is misspelled. It is perfectly preserved by every sense of the definition. So this is awkward.
Yep. I always, like, when we've done video, me and Cease have done videos, and we've seen that on the as some apologetic on some video for Islam. It's like kind of the old thing we always go to. It's like, well, our analysis of this video is going to be perfectly preserved, but if I had said like 2 + 2 = 5 or something in the video, even though it was perfectly preserved, I'm pretty sure like that wouldn't just like change 2 + 2 to = 5, because we go, well, it's perfectly preserved, so it can't be wrong. So therefore, because it can't be wrong, 2 + 2 does = 5, right? It's like just the weirdest argument to use.
It is, and I like to point out, like, the Quran has 114 surahs, and in surah 6, I think, or 5 or 6, it says, "Today I have completed your religion." Like, like that early in the game, you completed the religion, and then there's 98 more surahs. Like, it's not in chronological order. I think surah 9 starts in the middle of like a fucking thought. Like every surah starts with Allah, praise be, guide you, yada yada yada. But surah 9 doesn't start that way. It starts like in the middle of a thought, so it's clear that like something's missing here. It's super awkward when you start it. So I'm like, this does not seem perfectly preserved just by reading it. There's problems right out of the gate.
To address this, I don't think my question is loaded. My question is very simple. Is there a contradiction and a proposition or a message being preserved, and then that proposition or message being false.
He's not making any claim about it being false or true. He's saying
it's just saying there's no entailment from preservation to the truth of the truth value of the proposition or the message. It doesn't matter like that something is preserved. It has no bearing on the truth. So there's nothing loaded about it. It's just how it's just pointing out how things work. That's it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if he wants to bite that bullet, that's fine. He can do that, but that would be a weird one to bite.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I just wanted to kind of mention that. But yeah, so I don't know if you guys want to do if anyone has any questions in the audience, I'll put a thing up here so that people coming in can ask some questions. Cease, anything that you got left that you want to answer before we get some Q&A?
I'm trying to think if there was anything else I wanted to ask. No, I think for the time being, I think that's probably all I got. If I would love to have you back on at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I love coming on other people's shows. Maybe even more than doing my own. So
I'm the opposite. I much prefer doing this than. But I enjoy going.
I like doing them both for different reasons. But I like being a guest and not being the one who has to like control the show and just get to talk and be asked questions. Like that's fun for me.
Sure.
I love having the guests that we come on and getting to pick their brain. That's a lot of fun.
Right. I mean, do you have any questions for us?
It's
like, Cease, how did you get your hair looking so fine?
Wait,
I don't want to open a massive can of worms. But like we were talking about morality earlier, and I haven't.
Me and Cease got to put up the fists now.
Yeah.
We
can of worms, but
I'm actually, Mike. I'm hoping that we can do a part 3 to that this week if you're available.
Yeah, of course.
There was someone that emailed us that I think I saw in the comment section earlier. I think Just Questions was the username. He said he wanted to come on to talk about more realism and anti-realism.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, so I'm a more realist. I think moral truths exist.
Let me state where I'm at so far. Maybe we can go from there, or maybe you can help me go further.
Yeah.
Sure. So knee-jerk reaction is subjective morality. But then when people say, "What is your morality?" and I will say that what's consensual. How is pedophilia moral? Like, because it's not consensual. How is murder moral? Because it's non-consensual. Like, everyone has the right to bodily autonomy. I was like, but then would that be a objective standard? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So, I understand where we're coming from. Sure. Mike, do you want to go first? Do you want me to address?
Yeah. So I would say my position, if this helps you with that, I'm going to say no, it wouldn't be objective because the way I look at objective and subjective, subjective is going to be mind dependent and objective is going to be mind independent. And so it's not going to matter if all of us agree on what the standard is. We could all just agree well-being is the standard, or let's use your example and say we should care about consent. That's just gonna showcase that we all have similar mind-dependent desires and values. The fact that all of us have them universally wouldn't elucidate to it being objective. It would just state that we all have there's just a similar way that we operate as humans or creatures or whatever it might be. But for me, the objective part needs to be some mind independent part, which is why I think it's like an incoherent notion, because it's like saying that the values that you should care about exist somewhere else in the world to me. And that doesn't that makes no sense to untether values from your mind. for me, it seems to be, I don't like to use the word more moral, but it seems to be, let me just find the right word. It seems to be more like genuine is the best word to say whenever you realize that values are tethered to your subjective mind state, as opposed to saying that we should be in accord with something outside of that. Because that, I don't know, it seems weird for someone to say, I recognize what the good is, but I just don't want to do it, because then they still have the option to not be in accord with that thing. So it doesn't make somebody good, right? The good's going to have to come from your values. So it's always weird to me for someone to say, well, I only do the good because I recognize it's wrong, as opposed to really understanding why it's wrong, which is the fact that you just wouldn't want it to happen to you. That's what I think morality comes down to. It just comes down to things you wouldn't want to happen to you, and then there's a level of being consistent about it. Like, you can point out that any person that's like, I think rape's moral, if you did that to them, they would not enjoy it, right? You could just show that they're inconsistent on the principle that they employ. I think that's a much better thesis than going. Sorry, long-winded. Cease, you go ahead.
No, it's good.
I mean, I both agree and disagree. I think, from my perspective, this viewpoint of kind of separating minds from the external objective reality is a distinction that I think is erroneous, because I think minds are a part of the totality of reality. So, of course, when I'm talking about morality, I don't mean something mind independent, but it doesn't make morality relative, and by subjective, it doesn't make it not universal. Like, people have this idea that subjective means, well, you have your opinions about what's right, and I'll have my opinions about what is right. By mind dependent, I'm not talking about opinions. I'm talking about the nature of our consciousness and the way we experience the world and behaviors in the world. So yes, it does have to do with our desires. I don't disagree with that. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that undermines its real nature. And I think this is where I think the analytic and synthetic distinction comes in. Like, yes, linguistically, I agree that the problem remains. Like, there's nothing that I can say in terms of pure logic. There's no description I can give that on its own tells us the odds purely sort of on a verbal level. But on an experiential level, we clearly can recognize that certain actions cause a type of suffering that we inherently move away from. And it's not about coming up with like an argument or a word that will give us justification as to why we don't want that state of being. It's intrinsic in itself. Like, there's nothing else, there's no deeper level we have to get to. We can look at the state itself and recognize that because of the kind of conscious beings that we are, we're going to move away from those experiences and seek other kinds of experiences. And what we mean by odds is simply, what kind of behaviors will lead us to one end of the spectrum versus another. And all these things can be, what's the word I'm thinking of? Understood in terms of facts about consciousness, facts about neuroscience. They're all things that we can discover, we can analyze, we can look into the natural world, we can look into our minds, and see that there's a universal nature to what we are, and how to move them along the moral spectrum is going to be based on what the nature is.
So I agree. I agree with everything you said. My distinction on it, except for the fact that it's objective, to help Dadpool kind of see our disagreement, is that would be my exact standard, right? So I agree with almost everything C says, and even to the point where my moral standard's the same, and I think there's facts about consciousness that lead to this, but it's a mere naturalistic fallacy to look at facts about consciousness or facts about the way we are and conclude from those facts a set of values from that, which is the logical issue. So I agree that we internally recognize these things, but I don't think that you can go from descriptive facts about the way consciousness is to concluding some normative fact saying that because we have consciousness fact. Like, I always use this example, because we have a phenomenological state that we associate with pain, premise one, we just say that's a premise. That's a descriptive premise. Premise two, J. Mike doesn't want to feel pain. Conclusion, we ought not hurt J. Mike. My issue there is that is not valid. That's not a valid argument. It sounds valid. There's this thing called pain, premise one. J. Mike doesn't want to experience that. In conclusion, we shouldn't do that. But someone can just look at that argument and go, I don't agree with the conclusion. I want to punch J. Mike in the face. I want to cause harm. And we could fix that by me adding some third premise before the conclusion, like we ought to care about somebody's autonomy. Or maybe let's use your principle. We ought to care about consensual facts that people want to, right? We should care about consent, right?
But that value,
that to me is you have to accept. Well, you have to accept that in the premise as opposed to deriving it in the conclusion. Because once we employ, say, Dadpool's principle there, which is we should care about consent. Once Dadpool looks at that argument and goes, premise one, we experience pain. Premise two, J. Mike doesn't want to experience pain. Premise three, we ought to care about consent of another person. And Dadpool goes, yeah, that's actually my autonomy, or that's my principle. And he looks at the conclusion, therefore we ought not hurt J. Mike. He goes, yeah, that logically concludes because I've bought into the premise, and I would agree. But the problem is that the issue is you can have a normative premise in there that you buy into. The issue I have is deriving it from just facts alone, right? If we take that premise out of there, anybody can agree or disagree with the conclusion. If we put that premise in there, then someone like Dadpool can go, I agree. And then someone else who goes, I don't agree with that premise. I don't care about consent. They can disagree, and they just stop at that premise, right?
Okay.
But it would still be logically, deductively valid.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of how to approach this, because I feel like that question could be a whole other hour, right?
Yeah, really. Yeah.
But let me just say this. I think that is applying the wrong tool. You're going backwards there. My position is that values don't arise from thin air. It's not that we presuppose a certain value and then try to sort of defend it logically. Values, when you say that there has to be something beyond the facts, to me that is an incredibly strange thing to say. And I think this comes down to language, and it comes down to what do we mean by real? What is real beyond the facts? What is real beyond what exists? We're both physicalists, right? Like, what is real beyond what exists in the world? Mm-hmm. And to me, to claim that, to talk about morality in a universal way, we would need something that is beyond facts, or that is beyond the description. The naturalistic fallacy is saying we should do X or Y because we see it in nature. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that it is
descriptive facts about the world, which if you're saying facts about consciousness, that's to me is going to be the exact same thing, because it's facts about nature. Yeah, especially if me and you are naturalists or physicalists, because then everything under the domain is just facts about nature, which is my problem. I don't think there are facts about normative values. It's kind of like saying there's facts about universals or like abstracta, right? To me, it seems like a weird thing because it's not some independent thing out there.
But it is dependent. What I'm saying is that I think our values are dependent on our phenomenological experience. And so it's not that I have to assume any kind of linguistic system and then do the work. And so I can just live in the world and experience the world. And so the person that wants to go and decide, well, I'm going to beat people up anyway because I don't care, well, that's fine. The person can do that. It doesn't change the consequences both on other people and the consequences on their own consciousness.
Yeah, I would agree.
The behavior is going to have. So the person who just doesn't want to be moral doesn't have to be moral, but they can't go and kill and rape people and say, oh, but because I've not adopted your values, I'm going to call myself moral. Like, it's a linguistic issue. It's like, I can't drink poison till I'm dead and say that I'm healthy. Like, language is descriptive.
I get that. Here, let's. I don't want to. We'll go forever if we do.
Yeah, we could go.
We will go forever.
Just to give you, just to give you a little bit of where we're at, maybe that
because a lot of the stuff I'm gonna agree with Cease on. Like, so the thing is, like, I'm gonna agree a lot with what Cease says. My thing is, I'm gonna come back to this idea that I agree there are facts about like states of consciousness and the gradients of we experience. My thing is, I don't know where it comes down to all values. From my standpoint, are subjective. Whether I think blue looks better than green, right? Now, I get morality is different, but to me, all values are the same, that they're tethered to the mind. They're not tethered to something outside the mind. But that's where Cease plants his flag, and he has a distinction difference. So that's why it's been hard for us to navigate through it, because as a normal person who's a moral realist, not a normal person, I don't like that, because there's people that disagree with the distinction, but like the typical realist that you get, right? The typical like textbook realist you get is going to say there's a mind independent fact, and I'm like, that's absurd, and it seems that Cease kind of agrees with me. So we have this kind of weird thing to navigate.
It's like we're almost so close, and then there's like this one area where
there's tiny little nuance.
And it seems to be logic is the big thing, because I don't know if you're familiar with the is-ought gap. Dadpool, you are? Yeah. So I take that to be a major problem of assessing, just natural things or descriptive things, and saying that it can prescribe some way on how you should behave. I don't think that's. But again, we'll open up a huge, like you said, I don't want to open up a can of worms, and then the can of worms came like crawling out. So
I appreciate getting to have a little dialogue like that, because I'm not a philosopher. I have a very rudimentary education on philosophy. I took like 2 or 3 philosophy classes, so it's very much out of my wheelhouse. And I'm the kind of person that when I want to decide on my opinion on something, I feel like I have to earn it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think I've dedicated enough time and research into being able to logically defend my position on that.
I'm the same way as you are. Like, I really respect that perspective, and I just like you said, you'll help me with resources for my resurrection debates and stuff. I can send you all kinds of literature, the kind of moral philosophy tradition that I think you'd find interesting and helpful. So we can definitely share that with each other.
Cool. Well, I'm open to answering any more questions anyone has.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to address one. I'm going to scroll up and look. I'm going to address one thing on here just to clarify anything that I might have misspoke said. Yeah, so what I'm saying is being committed if it's a naturalistic fallacy. What I was saying earlier was that determining the good based on facts of consciousness, from my perspective, is what I'm identifying as. I'm not saying as my perspective. I'm identifying that as the naturalistic fallacy that's being committed. But
I would say that is still assuming a level of metaphysics that I'm actually not.
Sure.
No, it's not what I'm saying.
Okay. Yeah, that's gonna be the flag to kind of plant and go through then. But yeah, anyway, so let's look at.
Do any of you guys have any questions for our guests?
Scroll up. I wasn't paying attention to the chat at that last part because we got really into the weeds on the morality.
There's some back and forth about.
I will just say, Dadpool, I really love and appreciate your content. Like, it's some of the best that I've seen on social media. I think you do a really good job at clarifying. And I know that you just came out with a video responding to a video that was made about you a little while ago, and I haven't gotten the chance to watch that yet, but I'm going to do it probably tomorrow, and I'm excited to see.
It's a long one, but it's very good. We have Jim Bowen come on, Pat Longer comes on, and they're scholars in the field, and they help me respond. because they give like just other historical archaeological perspectives.
Right.
And it was a very fun. It's long. It's like 3.5 hours, and it ended up being. But I definitely recommend checking it out. Like, there's a lot of really good information in it.
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll have to go into the description and put your channel there for anybody. I'm so bad at putting descriptions for any of the videos.
Oh, I am too.
But typically we get guests. I think we've put most of the content on there. If not, I apologize. I think we have. I think we've been good about it. Someone's gonna check and call us out though. Be like, no, you didn't fucking do it one time. But yeah. So if anybody is sorry, go ahead, Cease.
I was gonna say the one thing we really need to start doing is coming up with like shorter edited clips, like sound bites.
Yeah.
To post. Like,
yeah, I need to do that.
Yeah, once you do it a few times and you're like, oh yeah, this is good, and then you're like, you do it a bunch of times, you're like, I hate editing. Yeah. Especially when like that's why I love doing the show we do, because we just go live, right, and just simple. But it does help to have. It's a good thing to have.
And I
you
do
have some
not
dedication.
I do not like watching my own video, like watching myself talk.
It's horrible.
I don't enjoy it. So,
yeah, I hate watching myself talk.
A 3-hour show of mine looking for
same way.
And it is just like, no, thank you.
Dadpool, I'm the same way. I like years ago, if I had said I had done like shows with Dillahunty and Shannon Q and people like that, I'd go back and rewatch it, right? But like I haven't been able to do it even on like I don't think like almost. Yeah, for really any shows I do at all, I can't go back and watch it or even debates unless we review them, because it just feels weird to like watch yourself.
Yeah, it does.
It's like I'm going to spend 3 hours watching me. Just feels narcissistic and weird to me. So I
can't do it. I mean, I would have edited the clips on my own if I could, but I cannot.
I've done a few of them, and I will do some. That there's actually probably a reason why I think a lot of them have been at the beginning where you cease, because I could watch clips of you, but probably not myself. So I was like, all right,
I think this would be a good episode to do some clips of.
Yeah, we got a lot, especially with Dr. David Johnson.
That's the other one I was going to say.
That was a great one as well. So there's a lot that have happened recently that we.
Any ones with my brother would be great to do.
Yeah, we have a lot there. But anyway, yeah. So we will get on out of here. I'm going to get everything set up to close this out of the show. Cease, I don't know if you want to give them a rundown on things that we'll be doing potentially this week that we have lined up.
I'm trying to, so hopefully in the near future, to have part 3 of the conversation about morality. I know someone reached out about coming on as a guest who's on your kind of more on your side of the conversation.
Sure.
We just need to talk backstage about when you're available to do that. I know that
Thursday might be good for me, so we could try that.
Cool. I know that Khalil, is that his name now?
Khalil, yeah. Khalil Allah. Khalil
yeah,
Allah,
so we had briefly discussed him coming on to talk about logic and Islam. I sent him an email. I haven't heard back yet. Hopefully that he'll reply soon.
I talked to him a little bit on private message not that long ago. Well, he DM'd me that video of the guy impersonating me, and I chatted with him for a second. So if he doesn't get back to you, I'll message him and get him.
Yeah, let's just address that real quick. I know I did that a few episodes ago, but somebody tried to impersonate you and pretend to be you. Like, how creepy is that?
It's a little strange. Some people were saying, "Nope, you've made it, and all this that." I'm like, for me, this looks like a Rocky downhill type of situation. I don't know about that. It doesn't feel good about this. Yeah, it's strange. No, I mean, I don't. Doesn't surprise me from the minions of the Darth crew. I'd say I'm flattered, but I think I'm more frightened. It's probably the better F word to use. Freaked out.
I've had my phone hacked. I've had people text me from anonymous numbers pictures from my camera roll. And like, there's nothing weird in there. It's just like pictures of my kids. that like takes me a picture. I'm like, hey, I got this picture of you. I'm like, that I
Thank
have
you
to
so
put,
much, Karen.
like what the flying fuck. So yeah, shit like that's weird.
It's strange. It's weird, but you know, it's
And it just goes to show how pathetic that those people are. Like,
I'm gonna point out one thing before we head off the show, because maybe we can talk about this on there. Kafi, I'd be interested on what a priori deductive argument gets you to God, because I don't think that exists. I don't think it exists for atheism. I don't think it exists for theism. So
yeah, I mean, as far as I'm
purely
concerned,
by logic, maybe we can ask him about that. But if that's the case, that'd be interesting. We have a lot to talk about there. Because I'm an atheist that's gonna just say I don't think there's a silver bullet on either side argument.
yeah, I don't think there's anything logical about what convinced him. I think it's just one fallacy after the next. So, but I hopefully he can come on and we can have that conversation.
Sure.
Yeah, like as always, thank you guys for supporting what we're doing.
Yes.
And if you want to support us on the Patreon, the site is patreon.com/accidents on trial. And then there's always YouTube, like and subscribe, and just come join us whenever we come on. So,
and thanks to Witter for Witter gave a $9.99 donation. That
thank
really
you so much, Witter.
It helps keep the lights on. So we appreciate that. And
She's amazing.
Captaindadpool, of course, thank you for coming along and just having a discussion with us. We just kind of go lighthearted sometimes. So if you want to come back and have some more, we can just
we would love to have you back.
We can have a topic, no topic, doesn't matter. So anytime,
let me know.
Awesome. All right, so much love to everybody. Stay tuned for, I'd say, Thursday. We will see you then. Peace out.